The argument that many find surprising whenever I do raise it is that this is not a legal presentation or a legal talk about compliance, which I'm sure you hear a lot about. This is about using international law, the way it was codified, the treaties, the conventions, the whole apparatus of it that exists, to have it as a tool to design technology. Currently, I am observing a very clear gap between two worlds. There are the international lawyers and the AI developers that are operating in near total isolation. There are different conferences, different journals, and different vocabularies that we use. And this is one of those instances where finally we get to speak on the same day at the same time about something that is quite unusual for a tech-oriented audience. The AI industry currently is almost entirely not considering the treaties that have been put in place over the past 70 years. I don't think that this is something that has happened on purpose or because technologists do not see the value in international law. I simply believe it is a matter of approaching it and speaking to each other the way we are doing today. Over 70 years, as I know many of you are aware, the international community has codified shared human values across many borders, cultures, and political systems. The result of that have been hundreds of treaties, conventions, declarations, and customary norms. In many views across the legal scholarship, this is the body of law that resembles what it means to have shared values across the globe and to agree what it takes for humans to begin flourishing together. The treaties, in my opinion, are not to be viewed just as external constraints that are to be used to stop or limit the way AI is deployed. Rather, I see it as a way to continue shaping the AI industry in a way that is just and humane and that brings from humanity forward in a way that international law was created to help societies. For that, I think it's really important to look through a whistle-stop tour of international law, which I'm going to do now. And of course, there is so much more to speak about. However, I believe that a lot of the folks in the audience, to them, international law is quite new. So I thought it is an important, just a kind of a corner store to set some of the key terms before going into the application to the work that you do on AI. There is a foundational layer in an international human rights law, and that is the International Bill of Human Rights. We all come from very different countries, and we know there is different forms of human rights and Bill of Rights in every country in the world. However, in 1948, after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was created, which was made to ensure that the human legacy is one in which dignity is protected, in which the right to life is protected, the right to liberty, privacy, thoughts, and many, many other rights that we are aware of in our own jurisdictions. Now, you may already start noticing some of these words that come up a lot in responsible AI and ethical AI discussions, the words of privacy, of liberty, of the right to expression. And the interesting fact is that a lot of these have already been pinned down in some of the treaties that we know well. One of the main treaties that I think is a corner piece to the way that the AI industry can move forward was agreed in 1966, and that is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Some of the articles I've picked out to talk about today are Article 17, which is the right to privacy, which acknowledges that there are implications for the way that we use any sort of tool in society. However, I take that forward and later want to discuss with you how we could apply that right to data pipelines and training data, etc. There's also Article 19, which is the article that is about the freedom of expression, something that later can be really well linked to safety filters and content policies in LLM, especially the infrastructure of LLMs. Article 26 is the non-discrimination article, and this is really interesting when it comes to evaluating model outputs and seeing how demographic groups are represented within the architecture and the design of AI systems. Finally, the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, as well in 66, has really engraved the right to education as a cornerstone of how societies can flourish. All of these are informing my research that I do on what respecting human autonomy means and what that means in technical terms. And I will come to that in a little bit. But before I do, I really want us to zoom in on one of the most interesting, in my view, conventions, and that is the Convention on the Rights of the Child. Why is it one of the most interesting and important ones? That is because it is almost universally signed and agreed upon. We have 196 state parties that have agreed on this wonderful convention, which is almost every UN member, except, for example, the United States. However, it still is the most widely ratified human rights treaty in history. There is a very interesting addition, which I will not go into now, but in the United Nations system, countries can agree to extend a convention and how far it reaches. You see, this convention was created in 1989. However, in 2021, there was a new addition that was made, and that is to address and acknowledge the rights that children have in digital environments. That is a very crucial part of the framework of the rights of the child. In the joint statement, the most recent one between UNICEF, UNESCO, the ITU, and the ILO, and it is not so important now to know what these organizations stand for, because the main important aspect of this is these are international organizations, some under the United Nations umbrella, that have acknowledged that most AI-supported tools and applications are designed not with children in their minds and not with the well-being of children at the top of the values and the considerations of AI developers. This is a really important aspect, as this aspect shows us that the United Nations world and the international law world is moving closer and closer to understanding how to connect the laws that exist to AI. What is really interesting is if you are working on an LLM, for example, that is going to be powering a children's toy or an educational platform, which we're seeing more and more happen frequently, you are not working in a normative vacuum. And what I tried to say this in my research is you are not starting from zero. You have a couple of really important treaties, such as the one I'm talking through to you now, which demonstrate how best to approach the rights of a child globally and what a child would mean. And this, of course, is really important, especially if you're designing global, applicable AI tools that need to respect laws across borders. There are also a couple of more treaties. I will not go too much into detail, but one of those is the discrimination against women, the elimination of all forms of discrimination against women. And this one, again, is really relevant if you are looking at how to train AI to audit the training data for gender bias has come up a lot recently in responsible AI research. If you look more closely into these treaties, and they're oftentimes quite simply giving you certain types of criteria of how to eliminate discrimination, and that can extend beyond the more traditional forms into AI creation. The creation of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, as you see, is one of the most, the new ones, 2006. It is not just about prohibiting discrimination, but it shows you also how you can take steps within your country or your company to reasonably accommodate and reasonably include people with disabilities. What this means in terms of AI design is that it comes from the ground up. It starts with really speaking up about the laws and rights that exist and implementing them as a team into the way that you design products. I also want to speak briefly about humanitarian law. I think many of you have heard of this, as this is the most commonly referred to law in the media landscape when it comes to war and conflict. And some may wonder why I would bring this up when it comes to ethical AI design. but why it is really, really essential to understand how the Geneva Conventions can inform the way that AI is coded is because of some of the interesting aspects I've put here on the slide. The first one is proportionality, which I really want to focus on in the center. Proportionality is about the way that you design something. It doesn't have to be a weapon. It can be any tool. The way you design something must be proportionate to the value it provides. And I hope you can start to see some of the difficult questions that the AI industry is facing in there. For example, I used the example of an AI children's toy, which is collecting a vast amount of intimate data. For really modular interaction, it can be a very small tool. This kind of product would not meet the proportionality requirements as the Geneva Conventions have set them out in a very different context. However, there is a lot to learn from the way that these thresholds are used in that body of law. And this is something that, again, this is a whistle-stop tour. However, I really encourage people to start reading more into these quite explanatory, self-explanatory cases at times and see how they can be applied to the way that new products are designed in the AI industry. Another term, precaution. The precaution principle within the humanitarian law aspect is something that can inform red teams and help create and conduct safety evaluations in a way that is really, really essential to do when it comes to especially high risk AI, such as those products used by children. Finally, the Outer Space Treaty. Again, you may wonder what the Outer Space Treaty has to do with the AI industry, but outer space back in the 60s was something that was very novel in the way that it was first accessible to human beings back then, in the way that AI is now in many ways. I really think the Outer Space Treaty will one day inform some type of international agreement, as it really, really looks at what supervision means. What does it mean to have a product that is authorized to move across space and time, across jurisdictions, and how can we better ensure that it meets the standards of jurisdictions across the world? Similarly, and this is a more negative view on AI design, is the Chemical Weapons Convention. Chemical Weapons Convention addresses a very strong dual-use precedent. Chemicals that can produce weapons can also produce really useful fertilizers, and I hope you can again see the trajectory of that into the AI coding landscape. And actually, this is something that the Council of Europe has recognized. I'm sure some of you have already dealt and worked with the Council of Europe Framework Convention on AI 2024, which was the first international legal binding AI treaty. So you can see that when these treaties come in, it is very useful to look back and see what other treaties have existed to understand how to approach a treaty such as the Convention on AI in the way that it was drafted and ratified by many key countries. So when an engineer, like many of you on this call, asks themselves, what values should I encode in my next product? What values should I encode in the ways, or should I ingrain in my red teams? There are many answers that have in many ways already have been worked out. I want to get a little bit more technical now and zoom in on the Children's Convention and the way that it can be applied directly in the likes of the teams that you work in. Article 3 states that one must always act in the best interests of the child. That means that if a team would really abide by this, it would have to treat engagement metrics or data collection in an ethical way as the primary objective to really protect the best interests of the child. Hereby, the child's cognitive development, its emotional well-being, and its right to rest and play, which is also ingrained in the convention, can be a primary consideration at and design stage. This can be encoded in the way that companies delegate tasks and ensure that their systems include the best interest assessment at each decision inflection point. Article 12 is another really interesting aspect of the rights of the child, and that is the right to be heard. And that, in design terms, is one of my favorite aspects. It delegates a mandate for participatory design. Before every feature log, before every creation of a structured aspect of a tool, children should be included, consulted, and invited into the meetings. And I know this is quite new, and not a lot of companies are even at the consideration stage of that, but they should be consulted when products are created for them. The target population should be part of the teams that are working on the design approaches. To zoom out of a children's perspective, the same can be said for people with disabilities, women, and gender biased, potentially gender biased products. There's a lot of guidance on that as well, which I'm very happy to share later, created by UNICEF, which helps companies understand how to use these normative requirements and actually build them into the work that their teams do. Article 16, I'm sure you work a lot with the right to privacy, which is ingrained in the UK system, across the EU, and across many other jurisdictions. However, if you want to produce products that work across the board, across countries, I really recommend looking at Article 16. Again, not as something binding, but as something that can actually inform the way that you approach the data collection and the way that you believe your AI should operate. Some of the aspects that can be done here is how much should data be, how much data retention should there be? What is the type of language that should be used in order for the child to understand how much privacy they are giving away? There must be a way for a child to ask and understand exactly how to speak to an AI, understanding its fiction. And this is, again, something that is not coming out of my research, but out of the general comment released last year, where it is a guideline already ingrained saying children should be notified when they interact with an AI system. So really useful cross-jurisdictional tools. 6 and 2, both articles are existing as well in the Covenant on Disabilities and Gender Rights, and that is the right to development. A human being has the right to develop physically, mentally, morally, etc. And that means that if you are creating an AI product, for example, an AI tutor, there must be an ingrainment of intrinsic motivation. Otherwise, it would really violate what we have agreed children to have a right to. Non-discrimination, and that is something that any AI company needs to work towards, is to create products which are accessible in languages beyond English, of course, if they're operating in markets that are not English speaking. I know that some of this may sound repetition and things that are already quite advanced in some of the more ethical AI businesses, such as Nokia Bell Labs. However, it is interesting to draw this inspiration from the articles that exist on the international sphere when you are coming into contact with jurisdictions where such rights do not exist, and you want to continue having an ethical product, you can rely on these more general statements of values that exist within these international laws. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, as an example, is a product of many years of deliberations of countries, companies, civil society, and children themselves working together. Attending many AI conferences, I noticed that it is often a question of which values, which ethical guidelines will we use. However, international law has already done a lot of the work that exists and a lot of the language that can help teams structure themselves. To make this real, it is really, really important to look at the articles and then discuss with lawyers how you could actually implement them in your own value system. And I've set some examples here, but because of time, I will move on to practical next steps that I can recommend and that I personally also always think are very, very powerful. And that is treaty literacy for AI teams. It is very essential to maintain information flows within technical companies in which international law is recognized as background information and knowledge, such as I did now with the whistle stop tour. However, really considering and looking at the treaties more closely and understanding how to implement this in your own work is really essential. Treaty-informed product requirements. Before really giving any kind of product to children or the healthcare sector or employment, it is very, very useful to look back at treaty provisions and see if any of those are disturbed in any way. Finally, there is also, as I said earlier, a real value in having participants join your red teaming and your other really beginning of design steps and see if they want to contribute early on to what you are creating. Again, I'm using a children example, but for anyone you are creating a product, really speaking to the target audience early on and not just at deployment stage can really change a lot. Finally, international law and AI development are currently really operating in separate spheres. And the argument I hope that I was able to bring closer to you today is that there isn't necessarily a need to continue operating in different environments. It is a resource that is there for you. Treaties are a great way to maneuver some of the ethical and moral questions that we are facing. And it perhaps, in my view, is the most underutilized resource available to anyone currently operating in the technology sector. I believe that some of the ethical questions that are the hardest are actually already coded and deciphered in some of the treaties. And for our discussion, I would love, of course, ask any questions, but I would also love to understand if you already have engaged in any kind of treaties and any kind of treaty work in the past. Thank you so much.